Before the sun rises over the hill country of Judea, a man presses his palm flat against his stomach and does not move. He has felt this ache before. The tightness under the ribs. The slow burn that climbs after every meal, no matter how small. His neighbors call it a curse. His mother called it the fire that has no flame. He walks anyway. Past the sleeping goats, past the well, toward the one tree at the edge of his field that has never once failed to bear fruit. He reaches up. He picks. He eats slowly, the way his father taught him, and by the time the sun clears the ridge, the fire has gone quiet. 3,000 years later, a doctor in a modern clinic will read a study on that same fruit and go very still. Digestive trouble is one of the most common complaints walking through clinic doors today. Bloating. Cramping. A stomach that never quite settles. Millions of people reach for a bottle at the pharmacy without knowing that long before pharmacies existed, there was already an answer growing in the fields where shepherds walked and prophets prayed. 10 snacks are hiding inside the pages of Scripture. Not sacraments. Not symbols. Actual food, eaten by actual people, for the actual discomfort in their stomachs. And one of them, the 7th one, is something most people have eaten every single Christmas of their life without ever knowing what it was quietly doing to their gut. This is not a list you scroll past. This is a kitchen you are about to remember. Hi viewers, quick question before we go any further. Have you ever eaten a fresh fig straight off the tree, yes or no? Tell me down in the comments. I want to know how many of you have actually tasted the real thing, and how many have only ever had the dried kind from a bag. Scripture does not only speak of the fig as something sweet. In the 2nd book of Kings, when a king lay sick and weak in his bed, it was a fig that was pressed against his skin, and soon after, he was well again. It is one of the oldest written moments in Scripture where a fruit is used, deliberately, as medicine. But for the stomach specifically, it was never the skin that mattered. It was what the fig carried inside it. Dried figs are dense with fiber, and folk tradition across the Middle East has used them for centuries the same simple way: soaked overnight in water, eaten at sunrise, the water drunk alongside them. Gentle. Unhurried. The kind of remedy a grandmother trusts more than anything with a label on it. Split one open and you will understand why. The flesh gives like honey that has just begun to set. Hundreds of tiny seeds catch the light. The smell is warm, almost like the inside of a sun-heated barn. It does not taste like medicine. It tastes like patience. But the fig was not the only fruit growing on that hillside. Beside it stood another tree, one so treasured that its shape was carved into the very pillars of Solomon's temple. Not painted. Not woven into cloth. Carved into stone, meant to last forever. Whatever this fruit was, it was worth building into the house of God itself. Split a pomegranate, and the sound alone stops a room. The crown cracks. Hundreds of ruby seeds spill into the bowl like something poured rather than picked. The taste turns from tart to sweet in the same bite, the way a story turns in its final line. Long before modern labs existed, communities across the Mediterranean and the Middle East reached for pomegranate seeds and juice as a stomach remedy, passed down the way most real medicine used to travel mother to daughter, not doctor to patient. Today, researchers studying the compounds inside pomegranate, particularly one called punicalagin, have found it worth a closer look for its effects on the same digestive bacteria that cause so much modern stomach trouble. The science is still being written. The tradition never stopped being lived. Picture a woman at her table at dusk, working through a small bowl of seeds after a heavy meal, the way it had always been done in her house, and her mother's house before that. No pharmacy. No prescription. Just a fruit carved into temple stone, and a habit older than memory. The next snack on this list was so ordinary that most people today would walk straight past it in a grocery store without a second glance. But when the prophet Elijah collapsed under a tree, starved and broken, too weak to go on, this was the food an angel placed beside his head. Not a feast. Not meat. Something plain enough to seem like nothing at all. And what that plain little cake does to a bloated, unsettled stomach is the reason we are only just getting started. Tradition remembers that cake as a barley cake, the daily bread of the poor, baked quickly on hot stones and eaten before it even cooled. It was not glamorous. It was not rare. And that was exactly the point. Barley shows up again in a much stranger scene. In the Book of Judges, a soldier inside an enemy camp wakes from a dream and cannot stop shaking. He dreamed of a barley loaf tumbling down a hillside, striking a tent so hard it collapsed. His friend does not laugh at him. His friend goes pale, because he knows exactly whose army that loaf represents. A humble grain, feared enough to appear in a soldier's nightmare. There is a reason barley carried that kind of weight in the ancient world, and it was not only about survival. Ground into flour and baked flat on a hot stone, barley cakes were the food a person ate when their stomach could not handle much else. Modern nutrition research has looked closely at a fiber found in barley called beta-glucan, and found that it may help feed the beneficial bacteria living in the gut, which in turn can ease the kind of bloating and discomfort that barley cakes were quietly addressing long before anyone had a word for gut bacteria at all. Picture the cake pulled straight off the stone. Nutty. Slightly sweet. Dense enough to sit in the hand like a small stone itself, still warm at the center. No oil, no seasoning, nothing but grain and fire and water. It was never meant to impress anyone. It was meant to hold them together. Sometimes the plainest food in the house is the one doing the most work. The next remedy on this list arrived in the hands of a woman riding fast to stop a war before it started, and what was packed into her saddlebag saved more than just her household's lives. When famine gripped the land and Jacob feared he had already lost everything, he packed a small offering meant to soften a powerful stranger's heart. Pistachio nuts were part of that gift, and so were almonds, chosen deliberately. Chosen because they were rare and precious enough to matter. Almonds carry a stranger history beyond that gift. In the Book of Numbers, Aaron's wooden staff, dead, dry, lifeless, is left overnight in the tabernacle, and by morning it has budded, blossomed, and grown ripe almonds, all in a single stem, all at once. It remains one of the strangest images in the entire Old Testament. A dead branch, suddenly alive, suddenly bearing fruit meant to nourish. Folk tradition across the Mediterranean has long treated almonds as a gentle food, easy on a tender stomach, and nutrition science offers a reasonable explanation why. Almonds are rich in magnesium, a mineral involved in relaxing muscle tissue throughout the body, including the smooth muscle lining the digestive tract. A cramping stomach is, in a real sense, muscle that will not relax. Bite into a raw almond and the texture surprises people who only know the roasted, salted kind from a gas station shelf. Soft. Faintly sweet. Almost milky, with a papery skin that gives way easily between the teeth. It is not a bold flavor. It is a quiet one, the kind that lingers instead of shouting. Here is a strange thought. How many foods in any modern pantry would Jacob have considered valuable enough to send as a gift to save his family? The next food on this list rode out on a donkey, packed by a woman who did not wait for anyone's permission. When Abigail heard that her husband's foolishness had put her entire household on the edge of a sword, she loaded that donkey with bread, wine, sheep already dressed for cooking, roasted grain, and two very specific items easy to overlook amid all that food: 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs. She rode out to meet an army led by a furious future king, and by the time she returned home, the bloodshed she feared had been avoided entirely. Raisins appear again in a scene with far higher stakes. An Egyptian servant, abandoned in the wilderness by the master who no longer needed him, is found 3 days later, starving, unable to speak from weakness. David's men give him bread. They give him water. And they give him a cake of pressed figs and 2 clusters of raisins. Scripture says his spirit came back into him. Not meat. Not a full meal. Dried fruit, and a man's strength returned. Raisins are dense with natural sugars and iron, a combination that has made dried fruit a traditional source of fast, gentle energy across cultures for thousands of years, long before energy bars existed on a shelf. It is not hard to understand why a starving man handed a cluster of raisins might feel his strength come back within minutes. Chewy. Wrinkled. Nearly black, with a sweetness so concentrated it tastes almost like syrup folded into itself. Nothing about a raisin looks impressive. And yet twice in Scripture, raisins show up at the exact moment someone's life is hanging by a thread. David himself wrote often about the terraced hills where he had once kept his father's sheep, hills lined not only with grapevines, but with a tree so essential to daily life that entire economies were built around its fruit. That tree comes next. Long before David was a king, an older story had already made one particular tree sacred. After the flood waters began to recede, Noah sent a dove out from the ark, and days later it returned carrying a fresh olive leaf in its beak. It was the first sign of life on a devastated earth, and it came from this tree specifically, not any other. Olive oil went on to anoint the heads of kings and priests. It was pressed, stored, burned in lamps, and eaten daily by nearly everyone regardless of how much money they had. Cured olives were a lunchtime staple for shepherds and farmers who needed something that would not spoil in the heat and would actually fill them up. Scientists have taken real interest in a compound inside olives and olive leaves called aleuropine, studying its antibacterial properties in the lab, including possible effects on bacteria linked to stomach irritation, along with its potential to ease inflammation. The research is ongoing, and the people studying it are careful not to overstate it, but the early findings offer a plausible explanation for a food tradition that has survived for thousands of years without needing one. Bite into a cured olive and salt hits first, sharp and briny, almost startling. Then a bitterness underneath that mellows the longer you chew, until what's left tastes almost buttery, almost soft. It is a flavor that takes some people years to appreciate, and once they do, they rarely stop craving it. A shepherd's lunch, most days, looked the same. Flatbread. A handful of olives. A skin of water. Nothing elaborate, nothing that required a fire or a plan. Just a food that had kept people upright and working for thousands of years, one small bite at a time. The next food on this list involves a lion, a swarm of bees, and a riddle nobody at the wedding could solve. Samson tore a young lion apart with his bare hands on the road to Timnah, an act of raw strength Scripture records almost in passing. What happened next is the part people remember. Days later, walking the same road, he turned aside to look at the lion's remains, and found a swarm of bees had built a hive there, dripping with honey. He scooped it out with his hands and ate as he walked. Honey shows up again and again at exactly the moments people are running out of strength. When Jonathan, exhausted mid-battle, dips the tip of his staff into a honeycomb in the forest and tastes it, Scripture says his eyes brightened immediately. Centuries later, John the Baptist survived in the wilderness on locusts and wild honey alone, a diet plain enough to sound like deprivation and rich enough to keep a man alive and preaching for years. Nearly every time honey appears in Scripture, it appears beside exhaustion, hunger, or weakness. It was not a treat. It was fuel, and for some, it doubled as medicine. Raw honey has been studied for natural antibacterial compounds that may help support a calm, healthy gut lining, and folk medicine across many cultures has used a spoonful on an empty stomach as a gentle way to settle digestive upset for generations. Raw, unfiltered honey behaves differently in the body than the heavily processed syrup sold in some plastic bottles, which has often lost much of what made the raw version worth reaching for in the first place. Pull a spoon through a piece of real honeycomb, and the wax gives slightly before it breaks. The honey underneath is thick, slow-moving, gold shot through with amber. It tastes floral in a way that shifts depending on what the bees fed on that season, sometimes citrus bright, sometimes deep and almost smoky. Something to think about the next time the holidays come around. Honey is baked into gingerbread, drizzled over roasted vegetables, whisked into glazes and warm drinks passed around the table every December, eaten by millions of people every single year who have no idea they are tasting the same food that revived an exhausted soldier 3,000 years ago. There was one more small, unassuming seed that made its way into Scripture, one so tiny it became the measuring stick Jesus himself used to describe how something small could grow into something enormous. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed, the smallest seed a farmer might plant, and yet it grows into a plant so large that birds come to nest in its branches. The comparison worked because everyone listening already knew exactly how small a mustard seed was. Some varieties are barely larger than a grain of sand. What the parable does not mention is that this same tiny seed had a long-standing reputation for what it could do once it reached the stomach. Ground mustard has been used across Mediterranean and Middle Eastern folk traditions for centuries as a way to ease the heaviness of a large meal, typically taken as a small amount of crushed seed stirred into warm water. Crush one open and the smell hits before the taste does, sinus clearing, almost peppery. It is not a gentle flavor. It announces itself. Small seed. Large plant. Sharp taste. A quiet reputation modern science is only beginning to take a closer look at. The next food on this list traveled across the desert in a set of saddlebags packed by a father terrified of losing his last remaining sons, and it grew on trees so treasured that entire caravans were loaded down with barely anything else. When famine forced Jacob to send his sons back to Egypt a second time, terrified of losing Benjamin the way he believed he had already lost Joseph, he packed the best the land still had to offer: a little balm, a little honey, spices, myrrh, and 2 items named specifically among the rest: pistachio nuts and almonds. In a season of scarcity, these were considered valuable enough to be part of an offering meant to win favor from the most powerful man in Egypt. Pistachios carry a fiber and healthy fat profile that nutrition researchers have studied for its role in supporting a healthy gut environment, feeding the same beneficial bacteria that struggle to survive on a diet stripped of real, whole food. It is easy to imagine why a food this dense with nourishment, small enough to carry across a desert without spoiling, would have been treated as treasure. Split the shell and the nut inside is a deep, unusual green, almost the color of spring itself. Salted, roasted, cracked one at a time between the fingers, pistachios reward patience the way few other snacks do. You cannot rush a bowl of pistachios. The shell will not let you. There is one final food left on this list, and it belongs to one of the most human moments in the entire Old Testament, a moment of complaint, of longing, of grief over food. Folk tradition across the region has long treated cucumber as a soothing food for an unsettled or irritated stomach, easy to eat, easy to digest, quick to cool the body down from the inside. Slice one open and the inside is pale green, almost translucent near the seeds, beaded with its own moisture. The taste is clean, almost like try it this week the way it was originally eaten, simply, without dressing it up, without turning it into something it was never meant to be. Notice what changes. The food of the Bible was never separate from the healing of the Bible. They were always the same thing, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to notice. But snacks were never the whole story of what these people leaned on. There was something else poured into a bowl and dipped into rather than chewed. A drink so ordinary that Ruth herself was offered it in the middle of a barley field, dipped straight from the jar, and so overlooked today that almost no modern reader stops to ask what it actually was, or what it was quietly doing for the people who drank it every single day. That is where we go next.